Oh boy, do we really need another S120 Helicrafters video. I think the internet's full of them, but I've got one more. And this story is basically the radio from hell story. I did everything and it still doesn't work story. You can go crazy with these receivers. I mean, you can tackle any problem that you see on the internet with these receivers. You guys know about the silver mica finger disease in the IF cans, the bulging electrolytic capacitors, the dreaded plague of high value resistors over time. It sounds more like, you're diagnosing some disease than fixing a radio, but all of these things become very emotional. And there was a subscriber to the channel that had been following some of my videos and others on the internet. There's plenty of videos on this receiver. And he decided to, for his friend, refurbish the receiver and decided to go whole hog. Basically changing out all of the capacitors with the Hayseed Hamfest kit that you get. And he went beyond that, picking out certain resistors and other capacitors that looked suspect. He pulled the IF cans out and actually rebuilt them with ceramic capacitors, modern ceramic capacitors, retuned the cans carefully, went as far as to put a nice polarized plug in the set. It looked like $1 million when I opened it up. So why did I need to open it up? Why did I need to even see this radio that had all of this work done to it? Mike, I did it all and it just doesn't work. I don't have any sensitivity in the receiver. I can't find the problem. I'm banging my head against the wall. I really need help with this receiver. And of course, my reply is, I'm not really a radio repair guy. I'm not in that business. And I've never heard of one of these not working at all after such a massive operation, unless maybe there is an error in the receiver. So I agreed to receive the receiver. And of course, I was looking for some easy mistake. Maybe a wire was put back wrong, or a capacitor or a resistor just got put on the wrong pin of the tube socket. Something simple. But after what he had done to the receiver was absolutely top notch. It was beautifully done. And what I noted was a bunch of noise and buzzing, that these radios will buzz, especially if they're plugged in backwards. And backwards, remember, we didn't have these polarized plugs in the old days. They were both equal. So you could plug it in one way or the other way, and typically one way would be quiet and the other way would be noisy. And all that meant is the internal ground, which is isolated completely from the chassis. You were putting the hot part on the ground instead of the neutral. Not finding anything wrong, I started to measure voltages. And what I found was that almost all of the voltages were about 20 to 25 volts lower than it shows in the manual or the schematic. By the way, you can download the schematic from the BAMA website and others. And he had replaced the selenium rectifier with a silicon diode properly. Everything looked good, but it just wasn't giving the voltage. Now, you and I both know that today the voltages that we have on the line are higher than in the old days. If anything, removing the selenium rectifier and plugging into modern power, those voltages should be 20 volts higher, not 20 volts lower. What's going on with the receiver? Well, it turned out that the series fuse resistor had crept up in value and it was starving the input capacitor of voltage. So I ended up jumping that resistor with another appropriate resistor that put all the voltages in the correct range. So these parts do age and they do change over time. So once we got that straightened out, I was not getting anything on band 4. That's a typical problem. A lot of people wink at band 4 on this receiver. Oh, it never works on band 4. Works great, you know, broadcast band, band 2 for 80 meters, band 3 for 40 meters. But once you get to band 4, up, you know, up at 14 megahertz, you know, 20 meters and higher, forget it. Well, I disagree with that. I think this receiver works just fine on band 4, but it won't work fine if you have certain aging issues in the receiver. And this receiver had those. What I'm talking about is oxidation. Oxidation specifically on all of the ground points in the receiver. And I'm talking about those rivets, the rivets that are on all the tube sockets, the rivets that are on the 2 trimmer banks, which is the most important part of the front end, and all of the variable capacitors and hardware. You want to loosen that up and tighten it back up. Now this is all beyond the deoxit stuff and the cleaning switches and all that. We're all beyond that. This is more subtle than that. We're talking about ground points on the receiver. You have to get those ground points reestablished. And usually that's done by scraping around those areas and hitting it with a high power soldering iron and bonding it to the chassis. Once you do that, now the receiver starts to come back to life. Well, that was kind of working, but about mid-band and band 4, the oscillator would cut out. So I simply took the 12BE6 tube out and replaced it with another known working 12BE6, and suddenly now I had the whole band. So that's another thing to realize, that sometimes the oscillator, the Hartley oscillator that's used for the local oscillator here, it will not function because the 12BE6 doesn't have enough gain on the converter. So the converter tube might be low gain, so that's worth trying. And now we're starting to get somewhere with the receiver. Basically, I moved a few things around. The audio you can always improve by improving the wiring around the 12AV6, and usually you can get the noise down, the hum down in the receiver. So I always do that as a matter of fact. And I have a video that shows you how to do that. I have a video that shows you how to align the receiver, and also a video on taking care of any power issues, and it's called Death Box, okay? Is your Helicrafter's S120 trying to kill you, in other words? That's an interesting video, and you can learn a lot about the receiver with that video. The other thing about band 4 is you have to realize that on that band they use low side injection, not high side. It's high side injection on bands 1 through 3, but on band 4 it's low side. And unless you know that, you'll never get the dial to work right. So anyway, by the end of the ordeal, the receiver was picking up WWV on 25 megahertz, and that tells you that it has pretty good sensitivity on band 4. WWV on 25 megahertz, that's not bad. Pretty well calibrated too. I'm not going to touch it. Looks like the band 4 is pretty well calibrated. I think this guy's ready to go. And I did beat my head against the wall a little bit on this radio, because the first thing I saw in opening it up was that the ferrite loop stick was broken in 2 places. That thing flopped around, hit the chassis, and broke. And boy, that's not nice. So I had to find a way to clamp it and super glue it back together. And now that's probably stronger than it was when I got it. In doing that, I actually went as far as to rewind the ferrite rod. Kind of an exercise on my part. I didn't need to do that, but you know what? The wires were flopping around with the thing in 3 pieces, and the Litz wire didn't look too cool, so I stripped it right down to bare ferrite, and I put my own Litz wire on there, and my own center tap wind, and it worked first thing right out of the box. I didn't have to fool around with it. All I did was I measured the length of the Litz wire that came off, wound it kind of looking at the same spacing, and it worked first time, and it's better than new. So there were quite a few things I did to this receiver. So I'd like to list the things I did to this receiver to pep it up so that it works on all bands and is sensitive even on band 4. Probably the most important thing to understand is there were no errors in this receiver. The person who modified the receiver, I'm not going to say modified, recapped the receiver, replaced suspect resistors and capacitors, did an excellent job. There was no electrical error in this receiver. Everything that I did was simply beyond replacing parts. It was all about improving the grounding, because the rivets that are on the tube sockets, the rivets that are around the trimmers, lots of other hardware around the variable capacitors had oxidized over the years and they'd lost their conductivity. Just doing that, just scraping those rivets and those areas and hitting them with solder and getting a good connection to the chassis, it was night and day with the receiver. You're not going to see that on the schematic, but you really do have to have a good chassis ground on these things. And all kinds of bad things can happen if you don't have good grounding. Also, the voltages right across the board were low, 20 to 25 volts low, and he had replaced the selenium rectifier with a nice silicon diode. If anything, the voltages should have been too high. That turned out to be the fuse resistor near the rectifier diode. That guy had crept up in value, and I had to put a 22 ohm 1 watt resistor across it, and all the voltages returned to nominal, and of course that pepped up the gain. There was one final problem on this thing, and that was the 12BE6 converter tube. It simply did not want to oscillate on band 4. So I replaced it with a hotter 12BE6, and suddenly the receiver came alive, and it could be aligned properly. It's all about getting the receiver back to factory condition, which means everything is properly grounded, and now suddenly the receiver comes back to life. So this is quite an impressive job that he's replaced most of the capacitors, some of the resistors, and the kind of work I did was to simply solder these rivets better to the chassis by hitting every one of them on the tube sockets. Going over here to the trimmers, if you really want to do a job, nail these trimmers, especially the trimmers on the oscillators here, right to the chassis right here. You can see I've worked on the ground posts as well. They've got solder on them. And I've loosened and tightened all of these with deoxit, and deoxit on all the controls, of course, that's normal. Once all of that grounding was done, this receiver aligned up beautifully, and its sensitivity came back.
Letter that begins the name of
Next slide. Let's see what we got next here. Well, that's just a shot of us getting closer to our home.
40-meter CW.
You know, I used to like Jerry Lewis on the telethon. We were always watching the telethon. And he was pretty cool. He was kind of suave, you know. But when you see him, in the movies, lady, nope.
The first day of trial. WBZ News Radio. Local stories from local
Okay, there's WBZ on broadcast band. It's working great on the AM band. Let's try, well, band 2 isn't open yet. It's the afternoon. Let's try band 3. This is 7 point. Let's see if we can get CHU.
CHU, Canada. Coordinated Universal Time, 17 hours.
Yeah, it's working pretty good. Let's try band 4. Is there anything out there? There's 20 meters. It's picking up some digital. Okay, we're going to call this good enough. So I think we can learn something new from the S120 every time we play with one. This was such a popular receiver that a lot of you probably had one go through your hands as kids. They're a lot of fun and they still work. Now, if we had a little bit more to listen to on the bands, they'd be even more interesting. But the S120 can be made as good as new if you put a little bit of patience in and take care of that grounding situation.